They called him the King of New York, a man who could end lives with a snap of his fingers. But that night at Vetro Oscuro, Killian Corsetti didn't want blood. He wanted entertainment. He stared at the trembling waitress who had just shattered $1 million bottle of wine across his $3,000 suit and let out a laugh so cold it made the chandeliers seem to frost over. The entire room froze. Forks stopped midair. Conversations died on lips. Even the jazz pianist's fingers hovered motionless above the keys. Killian rose slowly from his chair, towering over her like a shadow given form. He pointed to the stage where a Stradivarius violin sat, waiting for a performer who would never arrive. "You ruined my evening," he whispered, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, but sharp as a surgeon's blade. "So, you're going to fix it." He stepped closer, invading her space, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne mixed with something darker, danger, perhaps, or death. "If you can play the Devil's Trill Sonata right now, on that stage, I'll marry you. I'll make you the queen of this city." He paused, letting the impossible weight of his words sink in. "But if you fail..." His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You'll wish you'd never learned what a violin was." The men at his table snickered. The bargain was a cruel joke, everyone knew it. A waitress couldn't play the most difficult violin piece ever composed. He was setting her up for humiliation before punishment. But Killian Corsetti didn't know who she really was. He didn't know that beneath the cheap uniform and calloused hands, Vivian Ashford carried the blood of a legend and a fire that had been waiting 3 long years to burn. If you want to find out what happens when a waitress' secrets collide with a Mafia King's challenge, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves drama, romance, and impossible bargains. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single moment of this wild ride. Vivienne felt her legs turn heavy as poured lead as she walked toward the stage. Each step was a battle between the fear that wanted to swallow her whole and the flame of pride that refused to be put out. She could hear the crowd murmuring behind her. Wagers whispered about how spectacularly she would fail, the sneers of powerful people waiting to watch prey get crushed. But she didn't turn around. She had survived worse than this. When Vivienne stepped onto the platform, the spotlight aimed straight at her face, blinding her for a brief moment. The Stradivarius violin lay there, silent, waiting on its red velvet stand, like an old friend she'd thought she'd lost long ago. She moved toward the instrument, and that was when a voice rose from the wings. Maestro Bernstein, the elderly pianist with snow-white hair and eyes that had witnessed royal concerts all across Europe, was looking at her with undisguised contempt. He stepped out, his voice rough with age yet still heavy with authority. "Step down before you get hurt. This isn't a place for amateurs." Vivienne met his gaze head-on, without blinking. "Devil's Trill Sonata. Please." Maestro Bernstein froze. He stared at her as if she'd just announced she intended to fly to the moon on paper wings. "That sonata was the work legend," said Tartini had heard the devil play in a dream, then woke and tried to write down, never capturing even a fraction of its beauty. It demanded superhuman technique, ferocious emotion, and a soul willing to face the dark. "You're insane," he snorted, but he still lowered himself onto the piano bench. "Your funeral, not mine." Vivienne lifted the violin. The wood was cool beneath her calloused fingers, yet strangely familiar. She closed her eyes, and in that instant she was no longer in a restaurant full of predators. She was 7 years old, standing in a small room flooded with sunlight, and a man was kneeling to her eye level, placing her first violin into her hands. His warm voice echoed in her memory. "Music isn't sound, my little girl. Music is a soul trying to speak." Vivienne opened her eyes. She set the violin on her shoulder, her chin resting lightly on the chin rest, the bow rising. Down below, Killian Corsetti didn't even look toward the stage. He was signaling to Bruno, the hulking bodyguard behind him, to have the car ready. In his mind, this game was already over. The girl would produce a few shrill screeches. He'd have someone drag her outside, and tonight would end with at least a little entertainment for his boredom. Then the first note rang out. It didn't simply ring out. It detonated. The sound tore through the air like lightning splitting the night, sharp and without warning. Killian went rigid in the middle of his gesture. His hand hung suspended in the air as if time had forgotten it. Notes poured from the violin like a waterfall plunging into an abyss, at times violent as a storm sweeping everything from its path, at times whirling like souls dancing in hell. Then, abruptly, the melody softened into something painfully tender, like the last whisper of someone about to die, like a tear falling in a night no one sees. And at last it flared into the fire of defiance, of a spirit that refused to be subdued. The entire room seemed bewitched. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the coldest-blooded Mafia men sat like stone statues, trapped inside the vortex of music they couldn't understand, yet couldn't resist. Maestro Bernstein, the man who had played for kings and queens, the man who believed he had heard everything worth hearing in this life, slowly rose from the piano bench. He said nothing. He only bowed, a deep bow from one master to another. The final note trembled, then dissolved into the empty air like a thread of incense smoke. Silence stretched for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, long as an entire lifetime. Then the room erupted. Applause burst like rolling thunder. Not the polite applause of social courtesy, but the explosion of people who had just witnessed the impossible. The ones who had bet on her failure were now rising to cheer. Women wiped away tears. Even the most impassive bodyguards were looking at her differently. And Killian Corsetti, the king of New York, the man who bowed to no one, the man who never stood for anything, found himself springing up from his chair. Not to threaten, not to command, but to clap. The applause was still echoing when Killian Corsetti started walking toward the stage. Each step of his landed like a war drumbeat, and the crowd fell silent on instinct. No one dared to breathe too hard as the Mafia boss moved closer to the woman who had just done the impossible. Vivian was still standing there, the violin still in her hands, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion, but her eyes didn't drop. She looked straight at him, and Killian realized that wasn't the look of prey waiting to be executed. It was the look of an equal. He stopped less than a single step away from her, close enough to see the sweat glittering on her forehead, close enough to smell the pine wood of the violin mingling with cheap perfume. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and deep. Vivian hesitated for a second. She could have lied, could have invented some name and disappeared into the night when all of this was over. But there was something in the way he looked at her, not the cruelty of a hunter, but genuine curiosity, that made her decide to tell the truth. "Vivian Ashford." Killian went still. His steel-colored gaze widened for a heartbeat before he managed to rein his expression back in. "Ashford." He repeated the name as if tasting every syllable. "Jonathan Ashford? The violinist who once played at Carnegie Hall?" Vivian swallowed the familiar pain that came whenever she heard that name. "He was my father. He died 3 years ago." Silence stretched between them, thicker than the cigarette smoke hanging in the restaurant air. Then Killian spoke, and his voice shifted slightly, softer, as if he were remembering something from long ago. "I heard him play once. 20 years ago. My father took me." Vivian couldn't hide her surprise. She hadn't expected a cold-blooded Mafia boss to carry a memory like that. A memory of music, of a father, of a moment when maybe he'd still been an ordinary human being, capable of trembling at beauty. Killian turned his back to her and faced the whole room that was holding its breath. His voice rang out, clear and final, so absolute that no one dared doubt him. "I keep my word." Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a single number. "Prepare the paperwork. Tonight." A whisper rose across the room like a tidal swell. Vivian felt her head spin. She stepped toward him, her voice trembling. "Are you serious?" Killian turned back to her, one corner of his mouth lifting. "I never joke, Miss Ashford." The world seemed to collapse beneath Vivian's feet. She'd thought this was only a cruel game, that no matter how well she played, he'd find a way to break his promise. But no, he truly intended to marry her. The most powerful Mafia boss in New York truly intended to turn a waitress into his wife over a single challenge. But Vivian Ashford wasn't the kind of person who accepted fate without setting terms. She drew a deep breath, forcing her voice to steady. "I want a separate room, and you're not to touch me without permission." The whole room seemed to turn to stone. No one, not a single person in 6 years, had dared set conditions with Killian Corsetti. Even other Mafia bosses had to weigh every word when they spoke to him. And yet this girl, this waitress in a cheap uniform with calloused hands, was standing in front of him and making demands. Bruno, the bodyguard, reflexively moved a hand toward the inside of his suit jacket. The men at Killian's table exchanged anxious looks. But Killian just stood there, looking at her, and then something strange happened. He laughed. Not the icy smile he usually used to threaten. Not the mocking laughter he tossed at people he despised. This was real laughter. A sound almost foreign even to him, rising from somewhere deep inside that he'd thought had died 6 years ago. "Interesting," he said, and the word carried a weight only those who understood him could feel. In the far corner of the room, a man in a gray suit watched everything with an unreadable face. Preston Blackwood lifted his glass to his lips, but he didn't drink. He only looked at Vivienne, eyes cold as steel, calculating something. A new pawn on the chessboard, he thought, truly interesting. The wedding took place that very night, in the VIP room of Vetro Oscuro. There was no wedding dress, no flowers, no music. Only paperwork, ink, and 2 signatures. When Vivienne set pen to paper and signed her name beside the signature of Killian Corsetti, she looked down at the printed lines and wondered whether she'd just signed a marriage contract or her own death sentence. The black limousine delivered them to the tallest building in Manhattan as the clock struck 2 o'clock in the morning. Vivienne stepped out of the car and lifted her head to look up at the glass tower piercing the night sky like a gigantic sword. A private elevator carried her up to the penthouse, and when the doors opened, she had to swallow back a gasp. Killian Corsetti's penthouse was larger than the entire first floor of the building where she'd once rented a tiny room. The ceilings soared, hung with crystal chandeliers glittering like artificial constellations. Pure white marble floors reflected the soft lighting. Paintings that Vivienne recognized as works by master artists lined the walls, and she was certain any one of them was worth more than her entire lifetime of labor. But for all that luxury, the place was chillingly cold. There was no warmth, no trace of life. It felt more like a museum than a home, a place meant to display, not to live. Bruno, the massive bodyguard with a face carved from stone, led her through the rooms. "This is your room," he said in a low, dull voice, stopping in front of a black oak door. Inside was even more beautiful than Vivienne could have imagined. A king-sized bed with silk sheets, a walk-in closet, a private bathroom with a bathtub carved from a single block of stone, a room fit for a queen. But when Bruno closed the door, Vivienne heard a small click. She looked up and saw a digital panel blinking beside the doorframe. An electronic lock. The room had an electronic lock, controlled from the outside. A gilded cage, she thought. A gilded cage. Exactly. Vivienne tried to sleep but couldn't. She tossed on the bed that was too big and too soft, her mind spinning with the insane events of the night. This morning she'd still been a waitress worried she wouldn't have enough money to pay this month's rent. Now she was the wife of the most powerful mafia boss in New York. Life really was a cruel joke. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, when she could no longer stand the 4 walls, Vivienne decided to wander. She was surprised to find her door unlocked. Maybe Killian had ordered that she be allowed to move freely within the penthouse. She drifted through long hallways lined with expensive statues and paintings, feeling as if she'd wandered into a labyrinth made of wealth and loneliness. Then she stopped in front of a door left slightly ajar, soft light spilling from inside. Vivienne pushed it open and stepped in. Her heart missed a beat. It was a music room. Not an ordinary music room, but a space designed with perfect acoustics, walls paneled in walnut, a high ceiling with gentle curves that helped sound spread evenly through the room. A gleaming black Steinway grand sat in one corner. And at the center, on a display pedestal of bulletproof glass with its own lighting system, was a violin. Vivienne moved closer, her breath catching in her throat. She recognized it immediately. A true Stradivarius, crafted more than 300 years ago by the hands of the master Antonio Stradivari, the kind of instrument her father had dreamed of all his life but never had the money to buy. She lifted a hand and touched the glass, and suddenly tears spilled over. She missed her father. She missed the days he'd taught her her very first notes. She missed the pride in his eyes each time she improved. And she missed the final years, when he sank into alcohol and gambling, when he sold his own precious violin to pay debts, when he looked at her with eyes full of shame before he died. As she wiped her tears, Vivienne's gaze slid, by accident, to the opposite wall, and she went rigid. A family photograph hung there in a dark wooden frame. A tall man with features identical to Killian's stood beside a beautiful woman and a boy of about 10, but something was wrong. The man's face had been scraped and torn by something sharp, deep gouges cutting through the image, as if someone had used a knife to carve hatred into it. "Can't sleep?" Vivienne flinched and whipped around. Killian stood in the doorway, his white shirt unbuttoned at the top, a glass of whiskey in his hand. In the dim light of the room, he looked more tired, more human, and also more dangerous. She quickly wiped the tears still clinging to her cheeks. "I was just walking around." Killian didn't speak. He stepped inside and stood beside her, staring at the violin in the glass case. "It was my father's," he said after a long silence. "He never learned how to play." Vivienne glanced at the slashed photograph. She knew she shouldn't ask, knew this was forbidden territory, but something in her pushed forward. What happened to him? Killian went still. His entire body seemed to turn to stone for a moment, so long it stole the air from the room. Then he said, his voice rough, "I lost him. Violently." Heavy silence settled over the space. Vivienne could feel pain radiating from him, even as he tried to hide it beneath that cold shell. She wanted to ask more, wanted to know who had done it, wanted to understand why he'd slashed his own father's face in the photograph. But before she could speak, Killian turned away, his expression returning to its familiar blankness. "You should sleep. Tomorrow you'll learn how to play a new role." "My wife." He walked out without looking back, leaving Vivienne alone with the violin, the ruined photograph, and 1,000 questions with no answers. She looked out the window, where Manhattan's lights blinked like an artificial sea of stars, stretching all the way to the horizon. A gilded cage, or a new home? The question kept echoing in her mind, and she knew the answer depended on whether she could find the real man behind the mask of Killian Corsetti. A week passed like a cyclone, sweeping Vivienne into a world completely foreign to her. The cold penthouse was now filled with fashion designers, makeup artists, and etiquette instructors. She was measured for dozens of dresses from brands she'd once only dared to admire through glass storefronts. She learned how to walk in 12-centimeter heels without wobbling, learned how to smile with just the right width of her lips, learned how to hold a champagne flute so her little finger curved upward in a way that looked effortless and natural. She was being trained to become a version of herself that was entirely different. Bruno supervised the process, the massive bodyguard with the stone-carved face, who seemed so cold at first glance, turned out to be a surprisingly patient teacher. Every day, while the other specialists took their lunch break, he taught her the things that truly mattered. Smile at allies, ignore enemies, and stay away from Preston Blackwood. Vivienne frowned. Who is Blackwood? Bruno was silent for a long time, his expression flickering with something she couldn't read. The boss will tell you, when he's ready. That was all Vivienne got before her first charity event, the public occasion that would introduce her as Mrs. Corsetti. The gala was held at a 5-star hotel on the Upper East Side, with guests that included politicians, business leaders, film stars, and powerful people Vivienne had only ever seen on newspaper front pages. She entered the grand hall in a tight red gown, black silk gloves on her hands, and Killian walked beside her like a king escorting his queen. Every gaze turned toward them. Vivienne felt the weight of hundreds of curious eyes assessing her, judging her, measuring her. She kept her chin high and her back straight the way Bruno had taught her, but her heart hammered wildly inside her chest. About an hour after they arrived, while Killian was speaking with a senator in a corner of the room, a man approached Vivienne. He was about 45, salt and pepper hair combed back to perfection, a handsome face with a smile as warm as spring sunshine. His gray suit was tailored with flawless precision, and the way he held his drink carried the air of old money, polished and refined over generations. "Mrs. Corsetti," he inclined his head, his voice deep and velvety. "I'm Preston Blackwood. I've heard you play the violin beautifully. I collect rare instruments, you know. Perhaps one day you'd like to come see my collection?" Vivienne smiled politely, but something about him made her uneasy. His smile was too perfect, too warm, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes remained ice cold, studying her the way an animal studies prey. She remembered Bruno's warning and felt a chill crawl up her spine, even though the room was warm. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice gentle but measured. "But my husband keeps me rather busy." Something flashed in Blackwood's gaze for a fraction of a second, too quick for her to grasp, and then his smile returned. Of course, he had just opened his mouth to say something more when a familiar hand settled on Vivienne's waist, gripping hard enough to almost hurt. Killian stood beside her, his face unreadable, but his silver eyes fixed on Blackwood with something more dangerous than hostility. "Blackwood," he acknowledged with a nod, his voice cold as steel. "Corsetti," Blackwood replied, the smile never wavering. "Your wife is lovely. Keep her carefully." "I always protect what belongs to me," Killian answered, pulling Vivienne closer against him. The two men stared at each other for a silent moment loaded with undercurrents, then Blackwood dipped his head and walked away, dissolving into the crowd as if he'd never been there at all. On the way home, in the back of the limousine, Killian sat in silence and stared out the window. Vivienne didn't dare speak. She could feel the rage rolling beneath his calm exterior. Then he spoke, and his voice had changed, no longer distant and cold, but carrying genuine concern. "Stay away from him. He's more dangerous than I am." Vivian realized, startled, that this was the first time Killian had spoken to her, as if she were someone who needed protection, not an object that needed control. She nodded and didn't ask anything more, but in her mind 1,000 questions spun in circles. That night, when the entire penthouse had fallen into silence, Vivian lay awake, unable to sleep. She thought about Blackwood's icy eyes, about Killian's reaction, about Bruno's warning. There was something she needed to know, and she knew she wouldn't have peace until she found it. She slipped out of her room at 2 o'clock in the morning, moving without sound across the marble floor. Killian's office was at the end of the hallway, and she'd seen the keypad code when Bruno opened the door earlier that morning. She entered the numbers and the door opened with a soft click. The room was drowned in darkness, lit only by city light seeping through the large glass windows. Vivian switched on the desk lamp and began to search. She didn't know what she was looking for until she found it. A red folder with a handwritten word on the cover. Blackwood. Vivian opened it, and the blood in her veins turned to ice. Inside were dozens of photographs. Photographs of young girls, some only 15, 16 years old. Beside each photo was a file sheet filled with complete information. Name, age, nationality, and a dollar amount, the selling price. This was a trafficking dossier. Preston Blackwood, the man with the warm smile and the aristocratic polish, was a trafficker of human beings. Vivian set the folder down on the desk, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. She'd thought she'd met the worst monster when she married Killian Corsetti. She'd been wrong. The next morning, Vivian woke with eyes red from lack of sleep and a mind weighed down by the images in the red folder. She had barely stepped out of her room when she saw Killian already there, leaning against the hallway wall, arms folded across his chest, eyes fixed on her without blinking. He knew. She understood it instantly from the way he looked at her. Not angry, not threatening, only a cold, patient waiting. "What were you looking for in my office?" Killian asked, his voice low and even. Vivian could have lied. She could have invented some reason. That she'd gotten lost. That she was curious about the room's architecture. Anything at all. But looking into his eyes, she knew a lie would only dig the gulf between them deeper. And after what she'd seen last night, she needed answers more than she needed safety. "The truth," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm looking for the truth about the man I'm living with." Silence held between them, heavy as the air before a storm. Vivian waited for anger to erupt, waited for threats about how she dared trespass on his territory. But instead, Killian only exhaled, a sound weary and old, as if he'd been carrying it for years. "Come in," he said, turning and walking toward his office. "Sit down." Vivian followed him into the room she'd crept through in secret the night before. In daylight, it looked less frightening, just a room with an oak desk, bookshelves, and glass windows that faced the city. She sat in the leather chair across from the desk, and Killian poured 2 glasses of whiskey, even though it was only 9 o'clock in the morning. He set one in front of her, then sat down in his own chair. "My father was Antonio Corsetti," he began, his voice deep and distant, as if he were speaking of someone from a previous life. "He was the head of this family before me, but he wasn't what you'd imagine a mafia boss to be. He had principles." Vivian listened in silence, not daring to interrupt. Killian stared out the window, his eyes going unfocused, as if he were looking into the past instead of the skyscrapers beyond the glass. He never touched trafficking. No drugs. He said those things destroy the soul, and even if we're criminals, we still need to hold on to our souls. He paused and took a swallow of whiskey. "Blackwood wanted a partnership. He had a transnational trafficking ring, and he needed my family's transport network. My father refused. He refused again and again." Killian's voice hardened, each word forced through a thick layer of ice. 6 years ago, my father was shot right in front of me, in our family restaurant, in broad daylight. Vivian sucked in a sharp breath. She remembered the slashed photograph in the music room, remembered the way Killian had spoken of his father with the 2 words, violence and loss. "I held him while the blood poured out," Killian went on, his voice almost a whisper. "He told me to hold on to my humanity." Those were his last words. He lifted his gaze to Vivian, and in those gray eyes she saw an abyss of pain he'd buried for 6 years. "I failed him. I know Blackwood was behind it, but I don't have proof. And while I've been searching for proof, I've become what my father never wanted me to become." Silence filled the room. Vivian felt something crack inside her, a wall she'd built to defend herself against this man. She understood now. He hadn't been born a monster. Pain and hatred had made him into one. "My father was Jonathan Ashford," she began, and Killian looked up at her. "He was a genius. Everyone said so. But genius doesn't mean strength." She took a swallow of whiskey, letting the burning liquid scorch her throat and give her courage. "He fell into gambling, then alcohol. He lost everything we had. The house, the car, the savings. And finally," she stopped, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. "He sold the Stradivarius, the violin my grandfather left him, the violin he used to teach me my first notes. He sold it to pay his gambling debts." Killian didn't speak. He only listened, and somehow that made it easier for Vivian to go on than any comfort ever could. "He loved music more than he loved me," she said, her voice shaking. "When he died, I hated him. I hated him for abandoning me, for destroying everything, for being too weak to face his own demons." Tears overflowed, but she didn't wipe them away. "But I miss him too. Every day, I miss his voice when he taught me to play. I miss the pride in his eyes when I finished a difficult piece. I miss the man he was before everything collapsed." She lifted her gaze to Killian. "I understand what it feels like to be betrayed by someone you love." The silence between them now wasn't heavy anymore. It was softer, as if an invisible thread were tying together two shattered souls, two orphans looking at each other, for the first time truly seeing each other. Killian reached toward her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. Then he stopped, as if startled by his own action, and pulled his hand back. "I want to help you bring down Blackwood," Vivian said, her voice steady again. Killian frowned. "Why?" "Because of the girls in those files," she answered without hesitation. "Because I could have been one of them. If my life had turned another way, if I hadn't had music to cling to, I could have ended up in a container on the way to someplace no one would ever find." Killian looked at her, and something shifted inside his chest. He didn't have a name for it, but for the first time in 6 years, the ice wrapped around his heart began to crack. 3 days after the conversation in the office, Vivian was invited to attend a meeting she knew was not meant for outsiders. Killian's private conference room sat one level below the penthouse, with soundproof walls and security so strict that even a phone signal couldn't cut through. Killian sat at the head of the table. Bruno stood behind him like a statue, and a younger man Vivian had never seen sat across from them. "This is Nico, my brother," Killian introduced, briefly. Nico Corsetti looked a few years younger than Killian, with messy black hair and eyes that were brighter, more alive. He nodded to Vivian with a friendly smile, so different from the constant chill of his older brother. "So this is the girl who tamed our lone wolf," Nico said, his tone teasing. Killian shot his brother a razor-sharp look but didn't answer. He opened a laptop and turned the screen toward them all. "Blackwood is hosting a charity gala this weekend at his estate on the Hudson. On the surface, it's a fundraiser for orphans, but we all know where that money goes." Bruno spoke, his voice low and blunt. "This is our best opportunity to get inside. His security system will be focused on the guests, not the server room. If we can get into the server room and copy the data, we'll have enough evidence to make sure he never lifts his head again. The problem is how to get in without raising suspicion," Nico said, folding his arms across his chest. "Blackwood's security isn't amateur. They check every person." Silence settled over the room as they thought. Then Vivian spoke, her voice steadier than she felt. "Blackwood invited me to perform. At last week's charity gala, he mentioned wanting to hear me play the violin. I can do it." The 3 men turned to look at her. Nico looked impressed. Bruno remained expressionless as always, and Killian's eyes darkened. "No," he said flatly. "Too dangerous." Vivian didn't back down. "Do you have another option?" Killian clenched his jaw, and she could see the muscle harden. They stared at each other in a silent war of will, neither willing to yield. In the end, it was Nico who broke the deadlock. "She's right, big brother. We don't have anyone else who can get in without suspicion. She's your wife, an artist invited to perform. Perfect." Killian still didn't take his eyes off Vivian. "If anything happens to you, then you'll come save me," Vivian said, her voice gentler. "Won't you?" Silence held for the length of a heartbeat. Then Killian exhaled, a sound of surrender that Vivian suspected not many people ever heard from him. "Fine, but Bruno will teach you the basics, and you'll do exactly what we planned. No risks, no heroics. Understood?" Vivian nodded, and the meeting continued with the details of the infiltration plan. But through the rest of it, she could feel Killian's gaze drift to her now and then, weighted with something he didn't put into words. The night before the gala, Vivienne couldn't sleep. She wandered to the music room, which had become her refuge on restless nights. She took the Stradivarius from its glass case, set it on her shoulder, and began to play. The melody that spilled from her fingers was Liebeslied by Fritz Kreisler, a piece her father used to play for her when she was small. Love's Sorrow. The notes, mournful and beautiful, filled the room, carrying every fear and every hope she couldn't speak aloud. She didn't know when Killian had arrived. When the last note dissolved into silence, she turned and saw him sitting in the armchair in the corner, eyes fixed on her without blinking. "What's that piece called?" he asked, his voice low and soft. "Liebeslied," she answered. "Love's Sorrow." Killian rose and walked toward her slowly. "Why do you always play sad pieces?" Vivienne lowered the violin and watched him come closer. "Because I've forgotten what happiness sounds like." He stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could count every rough shadow of stubble on his jaw, close enough to smell the familiar scent of sandalwood and whiskey. Then he lifted a hand and tipped her chin up gently. "Let me remind you." The kiss came as softly as a whisper. There was none of the brutality or possession she'd feared would come from a Mafia boss. This was a question, an invitation, a door left half open that she could step through or close whenever she wanted. Vivienne answered the kiss, and the world around them dissolved. There were only two people searching for something in each other, a connection both of them had believed they'd lost the ability to feel. Killian pulled back first, his forehead resting against hers. "I want you here because you choose to be here, not because of a mad challenge." Vivienne lifted her hand and touched his face, feeling the warm, living skin beneath her palm. "Maybe the reason has changed." Killian closed his eyes and leaned into her hand like a wild animal learning to trust for the first time. "When this is over, when Blackwood falls, I'll ask you something, and then you'll be free to choose." Vivienne understood what he meant. He was promising her freedom, the freedom to leave if she wanted, the freedom not to be bound by a marriage that had begun like a cruel game. And paradoxically, it was that very promise of freedom that made her want to stay with him more than ever. Preston Blackwood's estate sat along the Hudson River like a fairy tale castle lifted straight from the page, its pointed towers reaching into the night sky and thousands of lights glittering like falling stars. Expensive limousines lined up at the gate, releasing guests in dazzling evening wear. Vivienne stepped out of the car, her black gown hugging her body like a layer of silk darkness, backless, and slit high to reveal her long, slender legs. On her ears, diamond earrings glittered, concealing a tiny USB drive, and deep in her left ear sat an almost invisible earpiece, connecting her to Killian. She could hear his steady breathing in her ear, a reassuring rhythm in a sea of strangers. She walked into the grand hall and was immediately swallowed by crystal light, smooth jazz, and hundreds of elite faces laughing and talking. And then Preston Blackwood appeared in front of her as if he'd been waiting for her all along. "Mrs. Corsetti," he smiled, a smile so perfect it was chilling. "Did you come alone?" "My husband has something he needs to handle," Vivienne replied, keeping her voice gentle and her face composed the way Bruno had taught her. "He sends his apologies. His loss." Blackwood chuckled softly. "You'll be the star of tonight. Everyone is eager to hear you perform." He offered his arm, and Vivienne laid her hand on it, forcing herself not to shudder at the cold that seemed to radiate from this man. In her ear, Killian's voice came in a whisper. "I'm here. Bruno and I will enter through the back in 15 minutes. You just perform as usual." Vivienne couldn't answer, but she lightly touched her earring as a signal that she'd received the message. The stage had been set at the far end of the hall, with a beautiful violin resting on a red velvet stand. When Blackwood introduced her, the entire room fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward the woman stepping onto the platform. Vivienne lifted the violin, and in that instant, she cleared her mind of everything. No mission, no danger, only music. She played Sardas by Vittorio Monti, a Hungarian piece, vibrant and drenched in passion. The notes began slowly, seductive as an inviting dance, then gathered speed, faster, fiercer, drawing the listeners into a cyclone of emotion. Her fingers flew across the strings, the bow swept like flame, and the whole room seemed bewitched. Somewhere outside the estate, Killian and Bruno were slipping past the guarded fence at the rear. The music spilling from inside created a perfect cover, pulling all attention toward the grand hall. They moved like ghosts through dark corridors, following the map Nico had hacked from the security system. "The server room is in the basement. We're in," Killian whispered in Vivienne's ear, starting to copy the data. She kept playing. The final note rang out and dissolved into thunderous applause. Vivienne bowed, a smile on her lips, but her heart was pounding wildly. Now it was time for her to move. She excused herself to the restroom and slipped into the back hallway. Bruno had shown her the estate's layout, and she knew Blackwood's office was on the second floor, at the end of the left corridor. She climbed the stairs, counting each step, keeping her breathing steady even as her heart tried to leap from her chest. The office wasn't locked. Blackwood's first mistake. She slipped inside, closed the door softly behind her, and began to search. On the desk, she found a filing cabinet. Inside was what she needed: lists of names, ages, nationalities, for dozens of young girls, schedules for ships, names and addresses of buyers. She pulled out her phone and began photographing each page, her heartbeat roaring in her ears. "Done," she whispered in her mind. "Done." She tucked her phone into her coat pocket and turned toward the door. And that was when she saw Felix Crane standing in the doorway, blocking the threshold. Blackwood's enforcer had a face cold as ice and eyes stripped of emotion, like a snake watching its prey. Lost Mrs. Corsetti. Vivienne felt the blood in her veins turn to ice, but she kept her face calm, even allowed herself a faint smile. "I'm looking for the restroom. This estate is so large. I took a wrong turn." Felix studied her, his gaze sweeping from head to toe, as if hunting for the smallest sign of a lie. He didn't believe her, she knew that, but he didn't have proof, either. "Let me escort you back to the Grand Hall," he said, his voice cold but polite. "You shouldn't wander alone here." He guided her back, and Vivienne forced herself not to show her relief. As they walked down the stairs, she murmured into the earpiece, "Killian? I have the evidence. Where are you?" No answer, only static. "Killian?" She tried again, her voice lower, tighter with strain. Still nothing, only the meaningless hiss of a jammed signal. Vivienne's heart dropped into her stomach. She stepped into the Grand Hall, fighting to keep her composure while something inside her screamed, and then she looked up and saw Preston Blackwood standing directly in front of her, the smile on his mouth like the smile of a cat that had just caught a mouse. "It seems your husband has run into a little trouble," he said, his voice as gentle as if he were speaking about the weather. 10 minutes before everything collapsed, Killian and Bruno were in the server room of the Blackwood estate, where rows of machines hummed steadily like the pulse of a gigantic electronic heart. Blue light blinked from dozens of screens, reflecting off Killian's focused face as he watched the progress bar creep forward. 90%. Bruno stood guard at the door, one hand resting on the grip of the gun hidden beneath his suit jacket, his eyes never leaving the hallway outside. The room was steeped in tense silence, broken only by the machine hum and the distant music drifting down from the grand hall upstairs, where Vivienne had just finished her performance. 95%. "Almost done," Killian whispered, eyes locked on the screen. "This is everything. Proof of every trafficking deal Blackwood has made over the past 5 years. Enough to rot him in prison until he dies. 98%. Then the door behind them burst open. Bruno spun, drawing his weapon in an instant. But 3 men surged in, guns aimed straight at them. Killian shot to his feet, his hand reaching for the gun at his hip, but he froze when he saw the man standing behind the 3 soldiers. Harold Mercer, the 60-year-old man with snow-white hair and the familiar gold-rimmed glasses. The Corsetti family lawyer for 25 years. The one who had taught Killian chess when he was a boy. The one who had cried at Antonio Corsetti's funeral. The one Killian had trusted like a father. "Harold?" Killian's voice came out like a strangled breath. Harold avoided his gaze, staring down at the floor, his shoulders drawing in, as if he were trying to make himself smaller. "I'm sorry, Killian," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Blackwood pays more. And I'm tired of being loyal to the losing side." Time seemed to stop. Killian felt something shatter inside him, the last piece of trust he still held for people. The man had known everything, every family secret, every weakness Killian carried, and he had sold it all to the enemy. "You," Killian ground out, his voice cold as ice. "My father trusted you." Harold shrugged, finally lifting his head to meet Killian's eyes, and there was no regret left in him at all. "Your father is dead, Killian. Loyalty won't feed my old age." Killian lunged for the gun at his hip, but he was too slow. A red laser flickered, and 2 tasers struck his chest. Electricity tore through his body like thousands of needles driving through every nerve. He hit the floor, muscles jerking uncontrollably, the world blurring under the pain. Bruno roared and threw himself into the fight. The loyal bodyguard dropped the first man with a thunderous punch, twisted aside from the second taser shot, then seized the third by the throat. but they had numbers. From the hallway, 4 more rushed in. Bruno fought like a cornered beast, but in the end, a gun butt slammed into the back of his head, and he went down hard. Upstairs, in the grand hall, Vivienne felt it all happen too fast. 1 second, she was still standing among glittering guests. The next, 2 rough hands had grabbed her arms from behind. She struggled, tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood's voice flowed through the microphone, smooth and calm as if nothing had happened. "It seems our artist is feeling unwell. Please give her a round of applause and wish her a swift recovery." Polite applause rose, and inside that sound, Vivienne's muffled cry for help was swallowed whole. She was dragged through a back door, hauled down a narrow corridor, and thrown into the rear of a truck waiting outside. The steel doors slammed shut behind her. Darkness devoured everything. Vivienne lay on the icy floor of the truck, her whole body aching from the impact. She heard the engine start, felt the vehicle begin to move, rocking along roads she couldn't see. She forced herself to sit up, hands groping through the dark, searching for anything that might help her escape. But there was nothing, only cold, metal, and night. Time passed like an endless nightmare. It might have been 10 minutes. It might have been an hour. Vivienne didn't know. But then she began to hear a sound. Ocean waves, water striking rock, a distant ship horn. They were taking her to the docks, and she knew, with a certainty as cold as death, that they weren't bringing her there to let her go. Vivienne was thrown onto the freezing steel floor. The breath knocked from her lungs as her body slammed into the unforgiving metal. The stench of diesel oil punched into her nose, mixed with the bitter salt of seawater and the rust smell of aging iron. The engine groaned beneath her, the steady vibrations telling her the ship was moving. They'd left the harbor. She fought to push herself upright, her head still spinning from the impact, and that was when she saw him. Killian was bound to a steel chair welded to the deck. Rope cinched tight across his chest and around his wrists, and his face was bruised. Dried blood crusted at the corner of his mouth and along his temple. But those eyes were still blazing, not a trace of surrender in them, like a flame inside a storm. When their eyes met, Vivienne saw him lurch forward, the ropes going taut until they nearly cut into his skin. "If you touch her," Killian's voice roared, heavy with the promise of violence. Laughter rose from the shadowed corner of the cargo hold. Preston Blackwood stepped into view, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gray suit still flawless, not a single wrinkle, as if he'd just descended from an elegant party instead of standing in the belly of a cargo ship. "The Mafia boss in love with the waitress," Blackwood said, his tone dripping with mockery. How poetic. In the corner, Harold Mercer was typing something on a laptop, his eyes glued to the screen, deliberately refusing to look at anyone. He looked smaller and more pathetic than ever, a rat who'd sold his soul to the devil and now couldn't bear to face the consequences. Blackwood circled Killian like a vulture savoring its prey before tearing it apart. "You know what's funniest of all, Killian?" he said, his voice light, like he was making casual conversation. "For 6 years you've been looking for the man who killed your father. You dug, you investigated, you tortured, you killed, and the answer was always right in front of you." Killian ground his teeth, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to crack. "Say it." Blackwood smiled, the smile of a snake before it strikes. "I arranged it. Your father refused to work with me. He talked about things like principles and honor." He snorted in contempt. "I don't handle rejection well." Deadly silence swallowed the cargo hold. Vivienne watched Killian's face shift from fury to pain, and then into something worse than either. Something hollow and black as an abyss. "I waited 6 years for you to make a mistake, Killian," Blackwood went on. "And at last you did, because of a woman." He turned his gaze to Vivienne as if he were appraising merchandise. "I'll admit, she's rather special, but she isn't worth losing an empire." Killian jerked against the ropes, his whole body taut like a violin string about to snap. "I'll kill you. With my own hands." Blackwood only laughed and turned away. He walked to a large container at the far end of the hold and yanked the metal doors open. Vivienne's breath caught. Inside, dozens of young girls were huddled in the dark. Their eyes were dull with terror, their skin pale from lack of light, and some still carried bruises on their faces and arms. They were the merchandise from the files she'd seen, numbers with names and prices. "Tonight, they'll sail out to whoever pays the most," Blackwood said, as calmly as if he were talking about ordinary cargo. "As for you two," he turned back to Killian and Vivienne, "you're just loose ends that need cutting." He drew a gold-plated pistol from inside his suit jacket and stepped up to Killian, pressing the cold barrel to his temple. "But I'm a man of culture. I like music, and I feel cheated out of a full performance tonight." He turned to Vivienne, the smile on his mouth never touching, eyes cold as steel. "Vivienne, play for me. If you stop, I pull the trigger. If you bore me, I pull the trigger. Do you understand?" Vivienne felt the world collapsing around her. But then she looked at Killian, and his gray eyes met hers. There was no despair there, only a silent message, clearer than any words could ever be. Don't give up. She scanned the cargo hold, her mind racing against time. Metal walls, low ceiling, and in the corner, an industrial speaker system with a blinking green light, the kind used for ship-wide announcements. She remembered what Bruno had taught her about how sound behaves inside enclosed metal spaces. She remembered physics lessons about resonance frequencies, and a reckless plan began to take shape in her head. "All right," she said, her voice calmer than she felt. "But give me a microphone. I want the whole ship to hear it." Blackwood lifted an eyebrow, seeming amused by the unexpected request. Then he laughed, rich with smug satisfaction. "Why not?" He gestured for one of his men to bring a wireless microphone connected to the ship's speaker system. "A swan song," he said, handing the microphone to her. "Make it memorable." Vivienne took the microphone, feeling its weight in her hand. Blackwood didn't know he'd just placed the only weapon she needed into her palm. Vivienne took the violin a soldier had brought over on Blackwood's order and felt the familiar weight of the instrument in her hands. She moved slowly toward the center of the cargo hold, her eyes sweeping the space to fix every position in her mind. The industrial speaker system was mounted on the wall behind Blackwood and his men. Perfect. She stopped in a strategic spot, making sure that when the sound hit, it would slam straight into the people she meant to bring down. While pretending to adjust the microphone, she secretly twisted the volume to its maximum. Her fingers trembled slightly, but the motion was precise. Blackwood sat down on a folding chair, his gun still trained on Killian's head, but his posture had loosened. He thought he'd won. He thought Vivienne was nothing but a small bird singing her final song before being swallowed whole. "Play," he ordered, his voice lazy. "And remember, if you disappoint me, your lover dies." Vivienne set the violin on her shoulder, closed her eyes, and began to play. The first notes were sweet as honey, a lullaby of a melody, gentle and soothing. She played a passage from Beethoven's Romance in F, letting the music spill through the hold like a soft tide. Blackwood closed his eyes, his head tipping back slightly, clearly savoring it. Even the soldiers seemed to relax, shoulders lowering, alertness slipping just a little. Killian watched her, eyes bright with understanding. He didn't know exactly what she planned to do, but he knew she had a plan, and he trusted her. Vivienne opened her eyes and looked straight at Killian. Then she changed. No melody, no music, only destruction. She dragged the bow across the strings with the strongest force she could summon, ripping out a shriek at the highest frequency she could reach. The sound shot through the microphone, amplified 100-fold by the industrial speaker system, and smashed into the metal walls of the cargo hold. Feedback erupted instantly. The shriek became a howl, the howl became a roar, and the roar became a brutal storm of sound. The speakers sparked, lights flickered madly. Harold Mercer went down first, hands clamped over his ears, blood seeping between trembling fingers. The soldiers staggered like drunks, utterly disoriented in the relentless sonic torture. Blackwood jerked hard, and in pure reflex he pulled the gun away from Killian's head to cover his ears. 1 second. Just 1 second was enough. Killian drove all his strength into his legs and hurled himself backward with everything he had. The steel chair tipped and slammed to the deck with a screech. The wooden backrest shattered on impact against the metal floor, and Killian twisted, tearing free the loosened ropes from his bleeding wrists. He launched at Blackwood like a wolf unleashed from its chain. In the corner of the hold, Bruno, face streaked with blood and one eye swollen shut, was moving too. The loyal bodyguard dropped the nearest soldier with a horrifying headbutt, yanked the gun from his hands, then turned and fired at the rope binding his own wrists. And then, from the rear hatch, a familiar voice rang out through the chaos. "Miss me?" Nico Corsetti appeared like a ghost, a gun in his hand and a smile on his mouth. He'd been tracking the GPS signal hidden in Vivienne's earring all night. Harold was trying to crawl toward an escape door, but Nico stepped into his path. "Going somewhere, counselor?" Vivienne stopped playing, gasping for breath, exhausted to the bone. But she had no time to rest. One soldier had regained his bearings and was lifting a gun toward her. Instinct took over. She hurled the microphone straight at his head. It hit him square in the forehead and he fell backward, the shot going wide, sparks bursting on the metal ceiling. At the center of the hold, Killian and Blackwood were grappling. Blackwood clawed for the gun that had fallen to the floor, but Killian was faster. He kicked it away, then grabbed Blackwood by the collar and drove his fist into the man's face. Once. Twice. Blackwood flailed, hand finding a dagger hidden in his boot, and he lunged at Killian. Killian slipped to the side, but the blade still carved a long line along his arm. Blood poured out, but Killian didn't stop. He twisted Blackwood's wrist, forced him to drop the knife, and slammed him down onto the deck. Blackwood reached for the gun again, and this time he caught it. But Killian was on top of him, and when Blackwood swung the barrel toward him, Killian shoved the man's wrist aside. A shot exploded, deafening in the tight metal space. Blackwood screamed, the bullet burying itself in his own shoulder. Killian ripped the gun from his hand and rose, breath heaving, blood dripping from his arm onto the steel floor. "I'm not killing you," Killian said, his voice cold as ice, heavy with promise. "I'm letting the law do it. You'll rot in prison until you die, and every day, you'll remember that I won." Vivian ran to the container where the girls were huddled in the dark. She flung the doors wide, light pouring in, and she saw faces streaked with tears staring back at her in disbelief. "You're safe now," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "No one can hurt you anymore." Then a hand settled on her shoulder and she turned to see Killian standing there, face bruised and bloody, but eyes fixed on her as if she were the entire universe. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "You're insane," he whispered into her hair, his voice trembling. "You almost made me deaf." Vivian laughed, the sound mingling with tears sliding down her cheeks. "Still better than letting you die." Killian held her tighter, and she felt his chest shake. She lifted her head and saw something she'd never believed she would witness. Killian Corsetti, the King of New York, the man who hadn't truly laughed in 6 years, was crying. Dawn broke over the Hudson River, staining the sky in bands of orange and pink, as if nature itself were trying to adorn the long, blood-soaked night that had just passed. FBI vehicles and police cars crowded the docks, red and blue lights flashing, braided together with the first sunlight of morning. The cargo ship was now surrounded by dozens of federal agents in dark blue jackets, collecting evidence and taking statements. Preston Blackwood was escorted down the gangway by 2 FBI agents, bright cuffs locked behind his back, his shoulder still seeping blood through a temporary bandage. The charming elegance was gone. He was only an old man with an ashen face and empty eyes, his criminal empire collapsing in a single night. Behind him, Harold Mercer was led away by another agent. The lawyer who had once been respected now kept his head bowed, unable to look at anyone. As he passed where Killian stood, he tried to turn his face away, but Killian didn't bother to look. To him, Harold Mercer had died the moment he'd spoken those words of betrayal in the server room. The rescued girls were brought off the ship one by one, each accompanied by a social worker. They trembled beneath emergency blankets, eyes still thick with fear, but when they saw the sunlight, a few of them began to cry with relief. Vivian watched them, and silently swore she would do everything in her power to help them begin again. Mount Sinai Hospital took them in at noon. Killian had an injury on his arm and a few bruises on his face, but nothing serious. Bruno lay in the room next door with a head wound that needed monitoring, but he was still alert enough to chase the nurses out when they tried to make him stay still. Vivian sat beside Killian's hospital bed, her hand wrapped around the one of his that wasn't bandaged. The hospital room was stark white and soulless, but with her here, it no longer felt cold. "You don't have to stay," Killian said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "You can go home and rest." Vivian tightened her grip on his hand. "I want to be here." Silence held between them, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need words to understand each other. Then Killian spoke, his voice small and fragile in a way Vivian had never heard before. "After everything that happened, do you still want this? Do you still want me?" Vivian looked at him, looked into eyes, the color of a storm holding fear of rejection, fear of being unworthy, the fear of an orphan who had built high walls to protect his heart. "I know who you are, Killian," she said softly. "I've seen the worst things." She paused and lifted her hand to touch his bruised face. "But I've also seen who you can become." Killian closed his eyes and leaned into her palm as if he were seeking salvation in that touch. "I don't deserve you." Vivian smiled, and inside that smile was warmth, resilience, and a touch of mischief. Lucky for you, I'm the one who gets to decide that. Killian opened his eyes, and she saw something shift in his gaze, as if a decision had been made. I'll change, he said, his voice steadier. I'll make everything legal, no more darkness. Is that a promise? Vivienne asked. Killian took her hand, lifted it to his mouth, and pressed a gentle kiss to it. It's a vow. That afternoon, Vivienne visited the rescued girls at a shelter the FBI had arranged. They were still frightened, still traumatized, but they were safe, and that was what mattered most. A young girl, not yet 18, caught Vivienne's hand as she was about to leave. The girl's eyes were wide, filled with hope. Will you play for us? She asked in a small voice. Something happy. Vivienne felt her throat tighten. She thought about all the sad pieces she'd played for so many years. Thought about Liebeslied. Thought about the pain she'd carried like a shadow. I promise, she said, holding the girl's small hand. For the first time in her life, Vivienne Ashford promised she would play something joyful. And she knew it wasn't only a promise to these girls. It was a promise to herself. 2 weeks passed like a clean, cool wind after a brutal storm. Preston Blackwood's empire collapsed completely as the FBI kept digging up more evidence from the server room and from the documents Vivienne had photographed. Dozens of accomplices were arrested up and down the East Coast, and the name Blackwood became a symbol of downfall instead of power. Killian stayed busy restructuring the Corsetti empire. He kept his word, step by step shifting every operation toward legitimacy, cutting every tie to the underworld. Not everyone was happy about the change, but no one dared object. After what had happened to Blackwood, all of New York knew Killian Corsetti wasn't a man to test. Vivienne began a new chapter of her own. She started playing the violin publicly, no longer hiding behind a waitress uniform. News of the waitress who had brought down a trafficker spread through the media, and invitations to perform started pouring in. She turned most of them down, but she knew that one day she'd be ready to stand on a great stage again. One night near the end of the month, Killian came to her room with a kind of mystery she hadn't seen in him before. Dress up, he said, his mouth lifting into the hint of a smile. I want to take you somewhere. Vivienne didn't ask questions. She put on a simple black dress, elegant in its restraint, and let Killian guide her into the limousine waiting outside. They drove through Manhattan streets, washed in light, until the car stopped in front of a building Vivienne recognized instantly. Carnegie Hall. Her heart tightened as she looked up at the magnificent facade of the legendary theater, where the greatest artists in the world had once stood. Where her father had stood, 20 years ago, when he was still the legendary Jonathan Ashford, and not a man drowning in alcohol and gambling. Killian took her hand and led her inside. The auditorium was empty, lit only by the soft glow of the stage lights falling onto rows of red velvet seats. They were the only two people in a space that could hold nearly 3,000 guests. This is where your father performed, Killian said, his voice gentle, reverent. Vivienne turned to him, her eyes blurring with emotion. How do you know? I looked into it, he answered simply, as if renting out Carnegie Hall for a night were nothing at all. They walked down the center aisle, their footsteps echoing through the hush, until they stopped right in front of the stage. And then Killian did something Vivienne never could have imagined. He went down on one knee to the floor, eyes lifted to hers with all the sincerity he had. In his hand was a small velvet box. That fateful night at the restaurant, he began, his voice trembling in a way Vivienne had never heard. I made you a mad challenge. You won. I kept my word. He opened the box, and inside was a ring set with a deep blue sapphire. Simple but refined, not ostentatious the way people would expect from a Mafia boss. But that marriage was a cage, not a choice. He looked at her, and in his eyes was fear he'd never shown anyone. Vivienne Ashford, you're free. You can walk away right now and never look back. But if you choose to stay, Vivienne looked down at the man kneeling before her. The King of New York, the man who had threatened her on that fateful night, the man who had married her without asking. Less than a month ago, she said, her own voice trembling just as much. I was only a waitress who spilled wine on the wrong person. You threatened me. You married me without ever asking if I wanted it. Killian bowed his head, as if bracing for rejection. But you also gave me a stage, Vivienne continued. A purpose. A reason to make music again. She knelt in front of him, cupped his face in both hands, and made him look into her eyes. I don't need saving, Killian, but I want to be loved. She smiled, and inside that smile was her whole life. And I think I love you. She reached out, her index finger pointing toward the ring. "Put it on me." Killian didn't speak. He only took the ring and slid it onto her finger, his hand trembling in a way a mafia boss should never tremble. Then he stood, pulling her up with him, and gathered her into his arms. He kissed her like she was air, and he was drowning. He kissed her as if the world might end in the next second, and he would regret nothing. This time there was no challenge, no coercion, no paperwork signed in the night. Only two people, standing on the stage where legends had once stood, choosing each other. 3 months passed like a dream Vivian didn't want to wake from. The Corsetti empire was slowly transforming. Each shadowy contract replaced by legitimate agreements, each dirty dollar cleaned through transparent business ventures. Killian kept his vow, and even though the process was slow and full of challenges, he didn't once look back toward the darkness. Lincoln Center was chosen as the site for their real wedding, not a hurried ceremony in a VIP room like before, but an event carefully prepared over 3 months, with every detail carrying the imprint of both of them. One morning, 2 weeks before the wedding, Vivian was sitting with a cup of coffee in the penthouse living room when Bruno handed her a thick envelope with the familiar Juilliard School of Music logo in the corner. Her heart tightened. Juilliard, the school she'd once dreamed of attending, the school her father had never been able to afford, the school she'd believed she'd lost forever. She opened the envelope with trembling hands and read the words inside. Then she read them again, because she couldn't believe her eyes. This wasn't an admission letter. This was an invitation to perform the opening of Juilliard's new season, an honor reserved only for the world's leading artists. "Killian," she called, her voice shaking. "What did you do?" Killian appeared from his office, his face calm as if nothing had happened, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I didn't do anything. They invited you on their own. The whole city knows your talent after what happened with Blackwood." Vivian looked at him, not believing a word. "You're hiding something." Killian exhaled and sat down beside her. He pulled another sheet of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. "All right, if you want to know, here it is." Vivian took the page. It was a notice about a new scholarship fund at Juilliard for gifted students with financial hardship. The scholarship bore the name Jonathan Ashford. Her vision blurred with tears. "Why?" "Because your father made mistakes," Killian said softly, his hand closing around hers. "But his music was real. And now his name will help children like you, children with talent but no chance, reach for their dreams. This is his legacy now," Vivian cried. She cried the way she'd never cried in front of anyone, letting the tears fall freely, not trying to hide them or hold them back. But these weren't tears of grief or anger. For the first time in her life, she was crying because she was happy. The day before the wedding, Vivian visited her father's grave alone. The cemetery lay quiet under the late afternoon sun, and she stood before the simple headstone carved with Jonathan Ashford's name, looking down at the flowers she'd just placed there. "I did it, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Not the way you planned, but I did it." She knelt and laid her hand on the cold grave. "And I forgive you. I forgive all of it." Wind moved through, carrying the scent of fresh grass and wildflowers, and Vivian could have sworn she heard a distant melody echoing somewhere, as if her father were playing the violin in heaven. The next day, Lincoln Center was dressed in white flowers and shimmering candlelight. There was none of the showy extravagance people would expect from the wedding of a mafia boss. There was only elegance, simplicity, and warmth. The guest list was a strange but perfect blend. Business leaders and politicians sat beside the young girls rescued from Blackwood's ship. Bruno stood like a statue in the front row, and if anyone looked closely, they'd see his eyes were slightly red. Nico sat beside him, wearing a suit for the first time without complaining. Maestro Bernstein sat at the piano, ready to accompany the ceremony, and he nodded when he caught her gaze. Vivian entered from the end of the aisle in a pure white wedding gown, no diamonds or glittering stones, only silk that flowed like water, and a silver locket from her father resting at her throat. She walked alone. No one was there to lead her, because she didn't need anyone to lead her. She had chosen this path, and she would walk it herself. Killian stood at the end of the aisle, and when he saw her, he trembled. The King of New York, the man who feared neither bullets nor enemies, was trembling before his bride. "You're so beautiful," he whispered when she reached him. Vivian smiled, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "At least your suit isn't covered in wine this time." Killian laughed, real laughter filling the hall, and the tension dissolved. When it came time for vows, they didn't use stock phrases. Killian held her hand, his voice steady but thick with feeling. You showed me that real strength isn't violence. It's the courage to love. I'll spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of you." Vivian squeezed his hand, her voice clear as a bell. "I don't promise perfection, but I promise I'll play our song with you, no matter how many minor notes it has." They kissed, and applause rose like ocean waves. But Vivian didn't hear any of it. She only saw the eyes looking at her, as if she were the entire universe. Instead of traditional wedding music swelling as the ceremony ended, Vivian did something that took everyone by surprise. She walked up to the small stage set at the far end of the hall, where Killian's father's Stradivarius violin had been placed in readiness. She took the precious instrument, set it on her shoulder, and began to play. The melody of meditation from the opera Thais flooded the room like a river of light. It was music about redemption, about a soul finding peace after years of being lost. The notes rose high, then fell back down in tenderness, carrying everything Vivian wanted to say without using words. About the pain that had passed, about the love that had arrived, about hope for the future. The entire hall fell silent, one person after another sinking into the music. Bruno wiped his eyes with the back of his rough hand. Nico tipped his face up toward the ceiling as if trying to hide his tears. The rescued girls held hands, their eyes lighting with something that looked like faith in tomorrow. And Killian stood there, eyes never leaving her for even a second, as if she were the only miracle he had ever witnessed. The final note dissolved into the air like a whispered farewell to the past. Only weeks ago, she had only been the girl who spilled the wine. Today, she was the woman who had tamed the monster. But the truth was, she had never tamed him. She had only shown him that beneath the cold and cruel shell, there was still a human being waiting to be loved. And him? He had never saved her. He had only given her a stage so she could save herself. In a city of millions of noises, they found each other. And together, they created a perfect harmony. This story teaches us that true love isn't one person rescuing the other, but two people finding the best version of themselves together. That the past can be painful, but it doesn't define our future. That real strength doesn't live in violence or power, but in the courage to love and forgive. If you feel this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss moving stories updated every day. What do you feel about Vivian and Killian's journey? Does this story remind you of anything in real life? Please leave a comment and share your feelings. We truly want to hear what's deep in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a life filled with joy and peace every day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.